Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to talk about some LGBTQ plus nonfiction recommendations. Seeing as it is Pride Month, I wanted to recommend some LGBTQ books to all of you. Generally, what I usually see when it comes to these recommendation videos is fiction books, but because I read more nonfiction, I figured I could do one that just focuses on nonfiction reads. So I've gathered sort of my top 5 of the bunch that I've read in the last number of years, and I wanted to share them with you. Of the 5 books that I want to recommend, 3 are memoirs and 2 are sort of histories. And I would just say that none of these books are particularly easy to get through. All of them do deal with tough topics at some points, so if you want to get better ideas about trigger warnings, I would definitely do that before picking them up. I'm going to start with the 3 memoirs and then talk about the 2 histories, so let's get started. The first book that I want to recommend to all of you is We Have Always Been Here by Samra Habib. This is a queer Muslim memoir by a Pakistani-Canadian author. If you are Canadian, you may have heard about this book. It was a 2020 selection for Canada Reads, but maybe if you don't live in Canada, this could be a new one for you, so I really wanted to highlight it at the top here. It says she has a very large picture on the back. This is Samra. In addition to being a writer, she's also a photographer and a queer Muslim activist. This book basically follows all of Samra's life up to where we are now. She was born in Pakistan, so it opens there and talks about her early life growing up there. Her and her family are Hamani Muslims, so they had to hide who they were to avoid persecution, and that resulted in them coming to Canada as refugees when Samra was little. And I do see some parallels in here between her and her family having to hide who they were for so long, and then Samra kind of hiding her queer identity for so long once she came to Canada and was growing up and sort of realizing who she was and how she had to keep that suppressed and hidden for so long. You see her growth as sort of coming into herself from being a young child in Pakistan to then coming to Canada and growing up here in a very different environment, having to deal with racism, but also having to deal with the fact that she was in an arranged marriage. She was betrothed to a cousin of hers from when she was in high school. And so that is a whole different thing, something that I never have to deal with. And so her life is just so very different from mine, not only in the fact that she came to Canada as a refugee and just sort of her religion and her family life and how different that was, but just also the things that she's into now, the choices that she makes, sort of the direction that she decided to live her life was just so different from mine. So it was very cool to step into her shoes and experience things from her point of view. When I read it, I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. The second book that I want to focus on is Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity, Love, and So Much More by Janet Mock. This is the oldest book on this list in the sense that this is the book that I read first of this bunch. I read it back in 2016. This book was really making the rounds in 2015, 2016, and so I picked it up because a lot of different people were talking about it. And this also kind of felt like we were still at the beginning of BookTube really embracing and sharing LGBTQ plus stories. So things have definitely grown since then. But I feel like when I picked this one up, we were still sort of at the beginning of this platform really talking about these kinds of books. For those of you that don't know, Janet Mock is a writer, a TV host, an advocate, and she originally came out as trans in a 2011 article, and Marie Claire, of all places, she was a journalist at the time, so she was within those circles, and I guess they did an interview with her, a focus piece on her. I have not read that, I'm just aware of that's kind of where she sort of came into the limelight. Although Janet may have kind of come out publicly in 2011 to a very wide audience, she has always been very confident in herself. She knew as a young child that she was just a girl trapped in a boy's body, and so she began transitioning in early high school, and by the time she was 18, she'd saved up enough money to fly herself to Thailand to get her gender confirmation surgery, which is just incredibly impressive, especially when you consider the fact that she grew up in poverty, dealing with racism. She actually was a sex worker for a while, and her circumstances really did not give her the resources to kind of become who she wanted to be, but she made it happen because she knew that that was who she was. I think another interesting part of this book is that Janet was born in the early 80s, so you're getting a look at LGBTQ plus culture in Hawaii, specifically in the late 90s, early 2000s, which is something I've never experienced, and so I enjoy that sort of window into what things were like there at that time. If you haven't heard of this book before, or you've seen it around and you're just looking for that little nudge to pick it up, I highly recommend that you do so. The final memoir I want to talk about is Punch Me Up to the Gods by Brian Broom. Brian is a gay Black man. He grew up in Ohio. He also, like Janet, dealt with growing up in poverty. And with Brian specifically, he also suffered a lot of abuse from his father because Brian always wanted to play with dolls or kind of dress up in more feminine clothing, and his father saw that as a threat, and so would try to kind of beat it out of him and try to push his son to not do those things. He wanted Brian to play sports and be tough like his older brother. But because Brian was sort of ashamed of who he was, and because of this abuse that he received from his father, he turned to drugs and alcohol in his 20s and 30s to cope. So this overall is a very depressing, intense story. But what I really want to highlight with this book, and why I think it deserves to be on this list, is because of the formatting of it. I really love the way he decided to put it together. He actually used the lines of a Gwendolyn Brooks poem to title the different chapters of this book. And so each chapter is focusing on a different part of his life that kind of relates back to that specific line in the poem. And some of the chapters are written in different ways. Some of them are written as sort of normal memoir chapters, and others he gets a little more creative. One of them is a journal entry that he wrote when he was in middle school. Another one is written from the perspective of his mother, and there's a few others where he gets sort of creative. So that was cool to see. And then in between these chapters that are titled after the poem, he's doing these little snippets of one story in which he's riding on a bus and he's observing this young boy and kind of following what was probably a snippet of maybe an hour of his life, but it's just broken down between these chapters. And it's just observing a sort of machismo, patriarchy, toxic masculinity that's kind of all around you, and reflecting on what was put on him when he was growing up. I will say that this is the lowest rated of the 5 books in this group, at least for me personally. I gave it 3 stars. But why I think it deserves to be on here is because I do keep thinking about it, just the experience of this book. It's very intense, but I just really loved the formatting. And so if you're looking for a memoir that does something a little different, I would definitely check this one out. Now moving on to the history books, the first one that I want to talk about is How to Survive a Plague, the story of how activists and scientists tamed AIDS by David France. This is a deep dive into AIDS and AIDS activism, as you might imagine, and it is a mix of the author's firsthand experience as well as journalistic research. The book has a huge arc. It begins in the summer of 1981 when the first New York Times article was published about this new rare cancer that was emerging, and it goes all the way up to 1996 when the first really effective medication became available to fight HIV/AIDS. So this follows really the major arc of the epidemic in the US with a particular focus on what was happening in New York City. There's a lot in here about the organization ACT UP, but also other organizations, all of their fights to just bring awareness to this epidemic, their own work that they did to try and do research for medications to really help PWAs or people with AIDS, just really trying to save their own community because many others, including the government, did not want to help them. It's very angering to read at points. There's actually a documentary of the same name that was released before this book came out. The documentary was put together by the same person that wrote this book, and I would suggest watching the documentary first, then reading this book. This is very large. It's over 500 pages. There's a lot of names, organizations, scientific stuff. There's just a lot in here. And if you watch the documentary, you see footage from this time. You see interviews with people who appear in this book. And so it does help you a bit with putting faces, names together. And so if you watch the documentary first, then go to this, you'll recognize some more stuff. It'll make that transition a little smoother for you. I did it the other way around, read this first, then watched it. Would definitely recommend not doing that. Because of how expansive this book is, I would recommend it for people that already have a basic understanding of the AIDS epidemic. If you are just trying to dip your toe into this topic for the first time, this would not be what I would recommend. But if you're looking to get that deeper dive, this is absolutely what you should read. I do have a full, deeper review on this book that I will link if you want to get a bit more information. The final book that I want to recommend is Transgender History: The Roots of Today's Revolution by Susan Stryker. This is a guide to American transgender history since the 19th century. It's written by a trans woman, which obviously makes me happy because we have somebody who is very much part of that culture, not somebody on the outside looking in. And this covers terms and concepts, major movements, medicalization, community, and a lot more. This is not a super long book, but it is a bit more academic leaning, so you just have to kind of be prepared for that going in. This is also the revised edition, so the second edition of this book was published in 2017, but we're already 5 years past that. So there's a lot more things that I think have happened even since this was released. I mean, there's a lot of upheaval now with trans rights, but this will give you that history that you need, that basic understanding to kind of make you more aware of everything that's going on if you're not already really embedded in this community. It is still just generally an excellent resource. It does also have further readings and resources suggested in the back if you want to extend beyond what this book has to offer. I do just think this should be recommended reading for anybody who is part of the LGBTQ community or wants to be an ally. Those are my 5 LGBTQ plus nonfiction recommendations. If you have any recommendations in this subgenre, please leave them in the comments below. I have a bunch more that I really want to get to, but I'm always interested in adding more to my TBR pile. Someday I'll be able to make another video just like this, because there are so many great books out there, and I look forward to seeing what you guys have to recommend to me. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.